There's a significant shift with millennials moving to the suburbs, and that's going to change the shape of our housing markets, which is going to be very important for homeowners and property investors to understand. This is a generation that once embraced city skylines, inner city cafes, and the hustle of urban living, but they're now packing up and heading to the burbs because they're at the family formation stage of their lives. But they're just not looking for the old white picket fence like maybe their parents did. So in today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, I'm replaying an episode of the Demographics Decoded podcast that I run each Wednesday with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. And I'm bringing you this show because I know there's lots of people who don't subscribe to Demographics Decoded, but follow, subscribe, listen to this particular podcast. By the way, if you get some benefit from my chat with Simon, I really think you should subscribe because that's a separate podcast as well. I'll leave a link in the show notes. But today's show is going to be very important for you if you're a property investor or a homeowner because it's going to touch on the discussions about remote work, the government's role in developing the suburbs, and the economic landscape that's now occurring because of this significant demographic change. Remember, each week in the Michael Yardney podcast, I try and give you some clarity amongst all the confusion that's happening, and I believe that demographics is going to shape our future, and that's why I want you to have a listen to my chat with Simon and me. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, imagine a generation that once embraced city skylines, inner city cafes, and the hustle of urban living, and they're now packing up and heading out for the burbs, but not for the white picket fence alone. Simon, I remember reading an article of yours that you wrote in The Australian where you explained how millennials, the same group that were once of killing off traditional lifestyle values, they're now leaving and reviving them, but they're doing it with a twist, Simon.
Exactly, because millennials, I'm one of the older cohort of millennials, born in 1983. Yes, we did kind of revolutionize a couple of things, but ultimately we follow a very boring, traditional life stage cycle that we follow through. And what millennials certainly did is we procrastinated collectively with having kids. So that means we were in a phase of what we would call adolescence, because we were free of adult responsibilities like looking after kids for quite a while, usually up until our mid-30s. So that means after leaving high school, there were about 16, 17 years worth of, first going to university at high rates, and then earning an income, partnering up, living as dual income households with no kids, things. You have a lot of money to spend. You live in the inner cities because you have inner city jobs. You spend your money on the famous smashed avocados, on overseas travel, a lot on yoga retreats, music festivals, photographing your lunch. All these things were absolutely crucial to this generation that created this or turbocharged the cafe culture in Australia, because they lived in very small apartments that were too small to welcome large groups of friends in. So you then socialize in third places, which are restaurants and cafes. And that, of course, then drives the idea of this avocado type generation. But as it turns out, sooner or later, even us millennials eventually made babies. And then the hipster apartment in the inner suburb becomes too small, becomes cramped. You move to wherever you can afford 3, maybe 4 bedroom house. And usually, for most millennials, that is not in the inner suburb, that's not in the middle suburbs, it is on the urban fringe. And so we are now migrating the big millennial generation to arguably the uncoolest area of our cities, which is suburbia or the outer suburban fringe.
Well, it's not the suburbs that their parents lived in. I guess they lived in the more inner suburbs, but millennials now are requiring the space and they're looking for somewhere to play cricket in the backyard or in the park or bike-friendly streets. Are our planning systems ready for this suburban renaissance, though, Simon, with all these people turning from avocado toast eaters into parents?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And I'm still to find areas who do it completely right. Because what you want, of course, is you take those people that have inner city jobs and you move them to the urban fringe. So you want, of course, really good connectivity from the fringe to the inner city center. The more sprawled out your city is, the harder that is. If you live on the urban fringe of Melbourne and Sydney and you have to go to the CBD, that is brutal. Maybe you are along a good train line. Congratulations. Many are not. So you have a lot of a car either to the train or maybe even into the city. That's hard. So you commute less frequently. You work from home if you can. That means the millennials then become the generation that is the keenest to work remotely, which is good for them. It makes their life significantly better because you have school pickups to do. You have this annoying long commute, a longer commute than other generations. So you avoid that. Unfortunately, millennials are meant right now in their career stage, meaning in the mid 30s to early 40s, they are meant to be the middle managers of the young workers in the office. They're meant to impart their knowledge to the youngins, and they're not because they're not in the office. So that's a problem on the workforce front. That is actually quite a challenge for all of those businesses that now need to create deliberate opportunities for knowledge transfer to occur rather than to bet on this natural transfer of knowledge that happened in the past. So that's quite dramatic. But ultimately, as the baby boomers, as the millennials move to the urban fringe, they have kind of ideas about how they would want to live. They have ideas about their house and they have ideas about the suburb. And the house is pretty clear. They want one bedroom for each kid, one bedroom for mom and dad, and a study. That's 4 bedrooms in a 2-kid family. So that's pretty big. They don't have an awful lot of spare time. So the big garden isn't as important as it was for previous generations. Also, the big garden is much more expensive. So you have relatively easy to manage small gardens to make sure that they can spend their spare time with family rather than maintaining the house. That changes the way. So if you go to the outer suburbs, they are big houses that take up most of the relatively small block.
The lots are a lot smaller, aren't they? Their parents, the baby boomers, moved to the outer suburbs as well, but the suburbs weren't as far out. And they used to have a Hills hoist in the backyard. They used to have an incinerator in the backyard. I'd think that would be sacrilege if you did that today.
Well, you're lucky if you have a garden that is as big as a Hills hoist these days. You see gardens that are comically small. They're essentially a balcony on the ground in many instances. But that's not even too much of a bother for millennials because they got actually accustomed to do a lot of their socializing in third spaces, meaning you socialize in a park with your kids. You have play dates in a park rather than at home because your house is, you have a living space, but the living space isn't so big that you can have 2 or 3 little crazy kids running in there on top of your own kids.
You have your birthday party at McDonald's rather than your family room.
Yeah, you outsource it. It's very important. So this is why we would see play centers, your chipmunks play centers, something
Yes.
they have an absolute boom decade ahead. Because this is where you socialize. And they, of course, need to cater to kids who want to jump around and throw stuff. And they want to cater to parents who want to just open their laptops. And so these very colorful kids centers need to have top-notch internet and they need to have good coffee for the parents who want to work there. All that is changing the way suburbia functions. So that is part of what millennials want from suburbia. They also are the generation that before they had kids were used to live in the inner suburbs. They quite often lived with maybe 1 car per household, maybe even car-free households. They traveled via trams around their cities. They used active transport, walking and cycling, more than previous generations. And they now ideally would want this in the outer suburbs. But are we building outer suburbs that are actually very walkable and friendly to a bicycle infrastructure? We could build them this way because, hey, it's new land. So it's pretty easy to build a bike path. It's much harder to rebuild or repurpose an existing street in Sydney into a bike path. That's much harder to pull off. So they could become those walkable communities, which I think increasingly they should become. But again, that is the urban planner speaking. This is not anyone talking who actually needs to finance these kind of infrastructure developments.
Well, these millennials were also used to the 20-minute neighbourhood in town, in the inner suburbs, where you could ride, walk, drive to multiple shopping centres. You had a Coles and Aldi and a Woolworths, you had picture theatres, you had places of religion, you had a number of gyms. That's not really what they're getting if they go into the outer suburbs, is it?
Not necessarily. That's what they would want.
Of course, it's what they want. They're used to it.
What they would want to consume. But so, yeah, increasingly on the outer suburbs, you live car-based lives because you need to drive everywhere. Fortunately, let's put it this way. There are plenty of examples of outer suburbs in Australia where you have traffic bottlenecks, where you have a big suburban pancake of an area on your map. And then there is only one small street that connects you to the main roadway. And that, of course, creates insane bottlenecks in certain areas. And so that then discourages the car. So you would then actually you would use the bike if it was faster than the car in that particular instance. But if there is no cyclable infrastructure, of course, you're then not making the jump. So the outer suburbs have quite a bit of a conundrum to solve there, because ideally you would build them very walkable, hyper walkable from the get-go, because it is dirt cheap compared to what it would do if the area further densified later on. But yeah, who pulls this off? Who finances this stuff at the moment? And if you are broke, if you're short cashed, under financed, you skip that step.
Now, in your article in The Australian, you also mentioned that as the millennials move out of the apartments in the inner and middle ring suburbs, the next generation, the Gen Zs coming to infill those, a much smaller footprint. What does that mean for our housing markets?
Yeah, so again, this is a two-part answer. Imagine we shut off migration, zero net overseas migration. That would mean that a big generation of millennials leaves the inner city and goes away to the urban fringe. They're gone. And then you only have a smaller cohort than the millennials entering those houses, those apartments in the inner city. That would mean that house prices fall, that vacancy rates go up. But of course, it's not what is actually happening, because we continue to add migrants. And migrants initially move to the inner suburbs. Only after they start families do they behave like the rest of the country and move to the middle and outer suburbs. So as long as there is migration occurring, this is turbocharging the inner city markets, because migrants come here before they have families, overwhelmingly. Remember that half of migrants into Australia are international students. They don't have families. They don't even have partners usually. They come as singles. They occupy the tiniest of apartments, and they drive this particular niche of the market quite happily. So the inner city is not at risk of being emptied out, despite the big millennial cohort leaving.
Okay, you've also spoken a bit about hybrid working, remote working, and that's reshaping the way millennials think about work and about commuting. What does this mean to the viability, again, of our inner city high-rise towers and all those towers around our inner cities?
Well, so the initial problem is that the traffic grid, if everyone were to go to the office 5 days a week, would need to accompany more what we call person kilometers, meaning you have more people commuting to the office because the city is growing, but now more people commute from even further away. So you have busier roads along a longer stretch of the town. That is problematic. We kind of solved this problem by allowing people to work remotely a bit more. So that takes people off the streets, cars off the street, people out of the trains. That's good. That gives you a bit of a breathing space in the inner city, because you then need to not accommodate much more population, or daytime population as it's called. So that's fine in the short term. In the long term, it means you will still see people return to the inner city at fast rates during the day, because ultimately Melbourne grows at 100,000 people a year, Sydney at 80,000 people. Some of those people will go to the office towers on any given day. Also, we are now, I would argue, in the phase where AI will very, very soon push people back into the office. AI takes over some of your boring technical tasks. It makes it much faster for you to read a report. You can get those AI summaries. It makes it easier for you to answer emails. Your emails get sped up by 20%, whatever it is, and so forth. And then the time that this frees up for you, this will also be given to work. And it will be given to work in the shape of interpersonal creative tasks in terms of communicating with other people's networking with other people. And these tasks are best done in the city, in person. And so we'll see more people go into the city again. And so the infrastructure pressure of the city gets bigger and bigger again, which again, how ready are you for this? If you've been to Melbourne, we're talking about the Swanston Street, Collins Street area at the busiest times of the week or the weekend, the sidewalks are busy. They're full. So you can't accommodate all that much more growth there. So which is why the long-term plan is to decentralize the place of work and say, we want to have not all those jobs in the inner city. We want to have them in secondary employment hubs. Your Footscray, your Box Hill, your Frankston in Melbourne, Parramatta in Sydney. That's the goal.
Now, Simon, the millennials are still in family formation stage, so for quite a while they're going to be moving to the outer suburbs, I guess following the path of their parents and the pet grandparents before them. So what role should local councils and state governments play in supporting this transformation of the suburbs, especially when it comes to infrastructure investing? Because when you go to those new suburbs, there doesn't seem to be as much infrastructure as many people would like.
No, and quite often the infrastructure that people, when they bought into the urban fringe, they've seen on a map, not in real life, because it's quite a difference whether you say, look, there will be a train line, and don't buy property based on a future train line, buy property based on an existing train line. It's very easy for a project to be delayed by 10, 12, 20 years. And that's half your working life. That's all of it. School life. So don't bet on this is the narrative here. And of course, what is the role for local government? I would always point to local government because they are pretty much putting the thumb up or down for a project. They can red light it, they can green light it. And local governments in this country should very much look to AI technology to make sure that the approval process of any building is much, much faster so that you have the chance of buildings to come up faster. I think ultimately we are weaponizing kind of environmental laws and so forth and citizen objections in regards to infrastructure. We're weaponizing them in the wrong way. Ultimately, these are great tools that are meant for us to not completely destroy and wreck our environment. These are good tools, but we also realized how to use them against progress, against infrastructure, because somebody, of course, you don't like a train coming through your back garden. And so you block it. But wherever you put anything, someone will slow it down. So there must be a bit more powers given to the people who plan and build infrastructure to actually push these things through, because we are still a fast growing 100,000 people each year in net terms is what we grow almost. This is a lot of growth that needs to be accompanied, and we need to weaponize, or we need to enable our levels of government to actually do this in the most efficient way. And at the moment, we are hamstringing them rather than helping them to push those projects through.
Now, in our last show, we talked about the cost of new development, and a lot of this infrastructure expense is now being passed on to developers who, of course, pass it on to the end user, the new home buyers. And it's not just the infrastructure cost, but we also spoke about the hidden taxes, the levies, the charges that the government's charged at all levels, which increases the cost of a new home considerably. Now, if you haven't listened to that last podcast, after you've finished watching or listening to Simon today, just go back on whichever podcast player you're watching this on or listening to this and have a listen to the show where we talked about how housing just isn't keeping up with the migration levels. By the way, there's lots of shows in this Demographics Decoded podcast. Go back, each one's its own lesson on how the trends are shaping our futures. And if you don't currently subscribe to the show, hey, just click the little subscribe button so that you get our show once a week. But Simon, last week we spoke about how all these hidden levies, taxes, charges, increasing the cost so that the governments are actually making more money out of all these new homes in the outer suburbs than the builders, the developers, because the land cost, and there seems no end in sight to that.
No, there isn't. And so there's a systemic problem. Have government, they learned quite quickly how to profit from this thing that happened, which is home building. So they get their taxes out of it. They also need the money from somewhere. So they got hooked to this. How do we make money of this? So why would they change it? It's nice it's the devil to draw tax from a different income source would be much harder for them. And it's unknown whether they would be allowed to do so by the voting public. And so we kind of stick with this. We kind of don't find new models of financing this. We do at times when we build to rent. This is meant to be a financial model that allows to think of housing as a longer term investment. So you have a longer term investment horizon. That means you don't need to look at short term feasibilities all that much. So that's a good idea, I think, as far as I'm concerned. That's what you could encourage as a federal government, get more institutional investors with long-term horizons into the market. But ultimately, as a government, you are a bit hamstrung. What you can do at the moment.
Now, you write regularly in The Australian, and that was the idea I got for this particular chat. I know you write weekly in the New Daily, which is not behind a paywall, but in this particular article in The Australian, you painted the picture of millennials turning into suburbanites. I bet if you would have told them that 5 or 10 years earlier, they would have winced. But I guess just like their baby boomer parents did. So, Simon, is this just a return to suburban bliss? Is it just a full circle movement, or is it a reinvention? Are they going to be doing things differently?
Well, so in many, many ways, it'll just be a replay of their of their childhoods that millennials had in their baby boomer parental homes. They'll want to replicate this, but they will do this with their own millennial coating, so to speak. So expect many, many more hipster cafes. Millennials continue to socialize in third spaces. They are used to a certain kind of cafe aesthetic. And if you visited the outer suburbs, this is occurring at record pace. Hipster cafes are just as hip in the inner city as they are on the urban fringe. Also, by the way, because the cafe owners have babies that move to the urban fringe and they don't want to drive to the inner city. So that's occurring as well. Then, of course, millennials, they change the way that they consume culture. Once you have kids that actually need you and are interested in you, so babies until like their teenage years, they have different desires and needs than you did in your 20s and 30s before you had kids. So all of a sudden, it's all around vicinity to sporting facilities, to schools. You hope that your kids make friends with their neighbors rather than people who live at the other end of town, something like this. So there is a lot of just non-change in the way that a family operates in family formation stage. It's just a life stage. And in a life stage, you act according to it. Yes, you might fight it a bit. So we, for example, completely gave up on the idea of a minivan. That's uncool, the people mover vans. Instead, we buy gigantic Ford Rangers. And we just drive our kids around in a Ford Ranger because it looks cooler than a minivan. That's part of it's still the same thing. You have your kids.
I'm laughing because we had a Toyota Tarago for our 4 kids, and that was the fashionable car at the time 30, 40 years ago.
Exactly. By now, you would drive a Ranger.
Exactly.
Like that.
That's what our kids drive. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just behavior. But ultimately, the utility is the same. You drive a large vehicle with many seats, and then you throw your kids out at the next footy oval. And that's what it is. And that's not going to change. And in a sense, the millennials can kind of complain a bit about it and go like, oh, it's uncool or something, or dread it. But you want this because millennials overwhelmingly had a very, very positive and fond childhood memories. And they now try to replicate this for their own kids. The problem is that statistically speaking, millennials might just be the first generation that is worse off than their parents. So they're not keeping up with the Joneses, the neighbors, which is what the boomers were concerned about, but they're keeping up with the parental image that they had. And so the richer and more successful your parents were, the more you have to keep up with the moms and dads rather than the Joneses.
Now, Simon, in these regular chats we have, you show the depth of experience. You've got the perspective of the things that are driving our housing markets. We talk a lot about that, but also about industry and the future of how our industries and jobs are going to be. So I know at the demographics group, you regularly spend time researching and then advising businesses businesses, organisations, institutions and policymakers, how can people get benefit from the information that you give them? How can people benefit from the talks?
Well, I think you benefit by listening. When I speak at events, when we consult for businesses, we very much try to get as much information about the clients or the audience in question as possible, and then try to show them their own world through the demographic lens, and to show the inevitable power that generational shifts have, that population movements that are very predictable in Australia, that they will have on their business. And then these businesses are not flying blind when they strategize about what to do in the next 5 to 10 years.
Now, I like the word you said, inevitable, because clearly if you've got the right demographic information, that the changes are virtually inevitable. It really is a crystal ball into the future. So if you're interested in having Simon speak to your company, your organization, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes how to get onto the demographics group and have him speak. Simon, this has been a great conversation as we've realized how suburban bliss is being reimagined by the millennials. This time round, there's Wi-Fi's, there's home offices, there's e-scooters. That's the sort of thing that I didn't have, our generation didn't have. I guess it did stand out to me how generational behaviours, that they evolve with time, responding to all the broader social, economic and technological changes. Millennials don't seem to have abandoned their inner city ideas. They're just reshaping them and moving them to the outer suburbs now that they're valuing more space, but they're still wanting the flexibility, the community and the similar sort of lifestyles. So if you've enjoyed our show today and you want to understand what the future holds for you or your business and you don't currently subscribe to the show, just click the follow or subscribe button on whichever podcast app you're watching this on or viewing this on. And do Simon and me a favour, please help us build our audience, because our aim is to help as many Australians as possible. That's the only favour we ask you. Please let somebody else know about the show, just like you found out about it, to help us spread the word to more people. Simon, thank you for your insights.
It's been a pleasure, and I'll catch you next week, Michael.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Simon. If you're a regular to this show, you know that each show I have a property trivia quiz where you can leave your answer. Go to propertytrivia.com.au, and each week 3 correct answers win a hard copy of one of my books. And at the moment I'm giving away Michael Yardney's Guide to Investing, a very comprehensive book. It's a hard copy book, but everyone gets a copy of an updated report I've just completed. This week's question I think is a pretty simple one, and it's: which state in Australia charges the highest stamp duty on property purchases? Go to propertytrivia.com.au, leave us your answer and tell me which state. I'll leave a link in the show notes, propertytrivia.com.au, but which state in Australia charges the highest stamp duty on property purchases? And even if you're listening to this show that is a slightly older episode, don't worry, your entry will still count because you'll still get the free report that I've got for you. Well, as always, Simon Kuestenmacher brings a lot of value to our discussions. And if you don't subscribe to the Demographics Decoded podcast yet, just stop and have a look at it. I'll leave a link in the show notes so that you can actually subscribe to that show, as well as this particular one if you don't subscribe or follow the Michael Yardney podcast. And clearly, as you heard from Simon, our housing markets are going to keep growing over the next years because of all the fundamentals falling into place. But if you haven't taken advantage of the on-property markets last year, over this next year, they'll be a little bit different. And you've got to maybe consider changing your strategic approach at this stage of the property cycle, because in my mind, not all properties are going to increase in value equally. In fact, I think we're going to have more fragmented markets than before. And in my view, probably less than 5% of properties on the market are what I'd be calling investment grade. So my suggestion is get the team at Metropole, my team at Metropole, on your side to give you independent, unbiased property and wealth advice. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely grow into generational wealth through real estate by offering strategic property and wealth advice. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. So whether you're just getting started or wanting to grow your investment portfolio, our team will help you with time-tested strategies that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades. And we've been helping clients with for close to 30 years. And we've got our own on-the-ground teams in our big capital cities. So having the team at Metropole on your side could mean the difference between average property growth and outperforming the averages. And that's going to give you financial freedom. That's going to give you and your family what it deserves. So book your complimentary, obligation-free wealth discovery chat. Go to metropole.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes and we'll be able to discuss your individual needs, let our wealth strategist formulate a plan or review your existing portfolio. We look forward to being part of your wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to share with you an old fable about that explorer Christopher Columbus, but what it means to you as an investor. I read somewhere that in, I don't know, something like 1493, that was a long time ago, but fresh from his first voyage to the Americas, explorer Christopher Columbus sat at a celebratory dinner with the Spanish nobles. Remember, they were his patrons. They helped him go across there. But instead of praising his achievements, they downplayed it. They said, oh, anyone could have sailed west and found land. You just happened to be the first. Columbus smiled. This is what the story said, and picked up a boiled egg. Gentlemen, he said, I will concede your point if you can make this egg stand on its tip. Now, one by one, these noble Spaniards tried carefully, creatively, but no matter how they balanced it, the egg toppled. Then Columbus took the egg, gave it a simple tap against the table to flatten a sliver of the shell, and set it upright. You see, he said, once you know how, it seems obvious. Isn't that true? I guess that's my message for you today. We often look at success stories, whether they're explorers like Columbus, entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs, or property investors who've built portfolios worth millions, and we think, of course, that was obvious. But here's the catch. Obvious is a post-achievement label. At the time, these ideas didn't look obvious. They looked risky. In some cases, ridiculous. Look, think about property investing in Australia. Years ago, investors who bought inner suburban Sydney apartments, were told they were mad because everyone wants to live in house and land. Fast forward, and family-friendly apartments in boutique blocks, the right sort of apartments, not the big high-rise ones, but those in the boutique blocks in tightly held suburbs, have outperformed in capital growth. Or those who bought a house in Brisbane a decade ago. People were told they're crazy as the market's been flat in Brisbane for years. Today, those same properties are easily worth double the price. Remember when people loved the idea of using a buyer's agent? Why would you pay somebody when you can buy a property yourself? Now, smart investors wouldn't dream of going it alone. So just like Columbus's egg, once the path is shown, once the results are in, people look back and say, oh, that was easy. Anyone could have done it. But you and I know the truth. The pioneers, the ones who bought in Brisbane before the current property boom, the ones who invested counter-cyclically in Sydney during the market downturn of 2022, endured doubt, criticism, and even ridicule. I guess that's the price of being early, and it applies to any form of innovation. I mean, Airbnb was dismissed. I remember I thought, what a silly app that was. Who let strangers sleep on their couch? Wow, I was wrong. Apple was ridiculed for removing keyboards from their phone. Remember before that there was the BlackBerry that had, BlackBerry, Blueberry, I don't know, that had a keypad. And Blockbuster shrugged off Netflix when it was offered it for sale. The best ideas look crazy until they don't. So let me ask you, what's the idea sitting, I don't know, in your journal or in your heart that feels obvious to you but is crazy to everyone else? Maybe it's starting a property portfolio. Maybe it's buying your next investment in a market no one's paying attention to. Maybe like Melbourne at the moment. Even though people are paying attention there now, aren't they? Is it building wealth for your children when your peers are still focused on upgrading their cars? True innovation isn't about everybody agreeing with you today. It's about everybody agreeing with you later. And as you push forward, enduring the doubts and sideways glances, remember these words from Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, and those who are seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who couldn't hear the music. So my message to you today is dance to your music. Take the steps that feel right for your future, even if others can't hear the beat yet. They'll catch up later. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show, But before you move on to the next podcast you're going to listen to, let me remind you I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. We call that Demographics Decoded, where Simon and I unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. In my mind, this is a must-listen-to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, but also for business people and entrepreneurs. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your podcast app where you're listening to this, or on YouTube. And of course, if you don't subscribe to this show, the Michael Yardney Podcast, why not click the link that says follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. So twice a week, you're going to get benefit from my guests and me. And I'd like to ask you a little favour, please. If you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody who would also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcast, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Or just tell them about it. Just have a chat with them. Now, I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing me a favour in my quest to help as many people as possible to become financially literate. And by the way, I've got a special bonus for you. As my way of saying thank you for subscribing, just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. It's just my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember, the information that we give you in this podcast is general information, not specific information about your personal circumstances, because we don't know about them. But if you do want specific information, you can always have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. If you really want to learn more, you can always listen to the previous podcast, the many episodes we've already published. Just go back to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?